Welcome to South Asia Chat, a podcast brought to you by the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. My name is Ramita Iyer and I'm a research analyst at the Institute. In June 2022, the Indian Defence Minister announced the Agnipath scheme for recruitment in the Indian Armed Forces. The announcement, however, has been faced with intense backlash from youths sparking violence in various parts of the country. Despite the resounding opposition to the scheme on the streets, top defence personnel have clarified that there will be no rollback of the scheme. To make sense of this developing issue and offer a quick analytical take on the motivations behind the Agnipath scheme and the challenges that it faces, I'm joined by Dr. Yogesh Joshi, a research fellow at ISAS. Yogesh, welcome to South Asia Chat.
Thank you, Ramita. Glad to be here.
To start off, can you tell us about the Agnipath scheme and how it differs from the existing channels of recruitment within the Indian Armed Forces?
Yeah, that's the crux of it in a sense. For clarifying the Agnipath scheme, we need to first understand how the recruitment actually happens. So the Indian Armed Forces, as they are structured right now, almost 1.5 million active personnel and 1.4 million reserves, making India's military forces second to China in terms of numbers. That constitutes 1.2 million of a standing army, the ground forces, a navy of 70,000 personnel, and an air force of 140,000 personnel. Now, what happens currently is at the level of the soldiers, the foot soldiers, they are, in some sense, it's a permanent commission. That you get recruited in the army for your life. Depending upon that, you rise consistently in the military hierarchy. But at least a recruit serves for at a minimum of 20 to 25 years. And depending upon whether he rises further in the rank, because the military has to continue having a young profile, they are phased out depending upon whether they are rising in the military hierarchy or not. And the same happens with the officer cadre as well. So it's not for life kind of permanent commission, but it does involve almost 20 to 25 years of a recruit's or a soldier's, working life in a sense. Now, the downside of it is that all these recruits, after at least 18 years of service, go back with a pension for life. The Agnipath scheme tries to undo that that manpower crowding in the Indian Armed Forces. It is trying to rejuggle the military out of this structure of permanent commission. So what would follow is a kind of a short commission into the armed forces, where young recruits will be given a tour of duty, as they call it, of 4 years in total, including 6 months of training. Now, after 4 years of serving in the military, 75% of this lot would be phased out. And during that period of 4 years, they would have a consistent salary, a medical insurance, and when they leave the forces after 4 years, they will have a lump sum amount of around 12 lakh rupees, 24,000 Singaporean dollars, or roughly 18,000 US dollars, so to say. Now, the reasons behind, and so 75% will be phased out, but 25%, depending upon the merit, would get in some sense a permanent commission. So it would retain that some of that experience into the armed forces. Now, what this would do is to reduce the average age in the armed forces, which is currently at around 32 to 35, to almost 24 to 25 years of age. It would lead to a lot of savings for the government, for the exchequer, particularly because once a soldier retires with a pension, the government has to foot the bill for the rest of his life. And even if he dies, his dependents get 50% of that pension. So that's a huge, burden on the exchequer. And there is also this idea that this tour of duty would provide certain kind of discipline, and training to India's youths. And with that kind of training and mindset from the military forces, they would be able to be successful even outside when they leave the forces. So that's the crux of the Agnipath scheme. So in a sense, that this process of tour of duty of 4 years is called the Agnipath, which is the process. But those 25% who would be retained out of that 4 years tour of duty are called Agniveers. So that's sometimes it kind of Agnipath and Agniveer kind of becomes it is kind of confusing, but that's the difference between the two.
So I want to focus on one of the things that you mentioned, which is that one of the primary motivations for this scheme has been based on economic considerations. So currently, salaries and pensions account for more than 50% of India's defense budget, while less than 5% is devoted to research and development. Can you tell our listeners how the Agnipath scheme can help address this expenditure disparity?
Right. So as I told you, that the Indian Armed Forces, particularly the Indian Army, is heavy in manpower. And rightly so, because it's such a huge population. In some sense, the armed forces provide a steady source of income, as an occupation, which has a lot of respect in the society. So it's quite attractive, for young youths. Now, if you look at India's defense budget, India spends around roughly 2% of its GDP on its military, which constitutes around $76.6 billion, to be precise. Now, 57% of this budget actually goes into paying pensions and salaries, which is a huge amount for any military, so to say. And but the worrying trend has been that over the last 20 years, the pensions part of it is the pensions part of it has steadily increased to almost 12% of the defense budget annually. Annual incremental increase of 12% in the last 20 years. That's a lot of money. And what it does is it creates a huge dilemma, particularly in a resource. Fundamentally, it is about resource crunch. There is only that much of a pie which can be distributed within the nation's India's budgetary allotments. So what the government is trying to do, and this has been proposed for quite some time. In fact, the Kargil Review Committee, after the Kargil War, also proposed to cut down on salaries and pensions. So it frees a lot of money for the government, particularly in a situation where the economy is not doing very well, but also the armed forces are suffering because of lack of modernization. And as the modern war becomes highly technological, there is an increasing feeling that India might be fighting wars of the 20th century rather than the 21st century, with the kind of organizational structures and technological infrastructure we have, compared to the heavy emphasis on manpower. So whatever money is going to be saved, and this will take time, over the years, in a sense. The idea is that it can help India modernize its military to fight the wars of 21st century. And therefore, and this again brings down to, I think, the problem here is India's growth as well, which has in some sense stalled. When you're growing at 10%, you can do a lot more. When you're growing at 5 or 6%, you are highly constrained. And at the end of the day, military strategy fundamentally rests on resources. So with the Agnipath scheme, the government is trying, in a sense, to balance that lopsided nature of India's defense spending, which goes a lot into into aspects which doesn't really cater to India's warfighting capabilities.
So another thing that you mentioned right at the start was that the scheme will help the army have a younger force. And this was also emphasized by Defence Minister Rajnath Singh in his announcement, where he said that there would be a younger, fitter and diverse armed forces in the country. So while having a leaner and younger army is desirable in the long run, experts have cast doubts that the scheme will compromise on military ethos and efficiency. What are your thoughts on this, and do you think that the military is ready for such a transition?
So the military effectiveness, rests on a number of aspects. One is training, planning, equipment, organizational clarity of what your missions are and how you're going to achieve them. But it's also fundamentally about intangibles like motivation. So a lot of aspects go into understanding of military efficiency. Now, the question Agnipath raises a number of questions on all of these aspects. So 6 months training compared to 9 months training for a recruit, and he over a period of 20 to 25 years he serves, he goes from basic training into specialized training over that whole period. So the first doubt basically is that whether the training being offered is adequate enough. And there is no aspect of specialization within those 4 years. And how would you do that? Because the time is so constrained. Uh, Planning is the other aspect of it. So the reform, the Agnipath reform, is going to bring a huge disruption. In terms of how the military is constituted, how it is run, how it plans to fight wars for that matter. And is the military ready to accept those disruptions and has planned, to minimize the mitigating effect of this huge organizational disruption. Third is equipment, in a sense. So one looks at 4 years of training and 4 years of the Agnipath scheme, and one wonders whether the soldiers who are coming in and being trained would be able to handle equipment. And this is a bigger worry for technologically more sophisticated forces like the Air Force and the Navy, compared to the Army, which still operates in a sense, is particularly in the infantry. Uh, you know, the equipment is far less sophisticated compared to the Air Forces and the Navy. But even in the Army, if one looks at, the technologically more sophisticated arms within the army, which is basically signals for that matter, or motorized infantry or the armor corps, where you need certain sense of technological, grasp of equipment. The doubt is whether you would be able to handle the equipment in that short span of time. The third is the organizational clarity within the military. So, is the military ready, in a sense, to imbibe this, to accept this reform while being clear on what its missions are? And particularly when you look at the manpower intensive missions which the Indian Army does. It does counterinsurgency on one hand, particularly all over the country, whether in the northeast or in Kashmir. It has to hold forces vis-a-vis China, which is where the deployment on the Sino-Indian border, particularly from the Chinese side, has seen increasing aggrandizement over the last 10 years. And you also need to maintain a superior level of force against Pakistan, which is one of your military strategies. So is there that organizational clarity within the military to kind of accept this reform while being focused on the missions, the numerous missions it has, and being able to deliver on that? But lastly, I think the larger questions have been raised on motivation. So for a soldier who is going to serve for 20 to 25 years, has prospects to rise in the military chain of command, has much more intermeshing, with his colleagues. And fundamentally, at the end of the day, in any war, you fight for the soldier next to you. So that's the primary motivation, which guides you in facing the consequences of death, so to say. So would there be that much of cohesion and that much of motivation in a military force which is mostly constituted by soldiers who have to just serve 4 years in the military, and have the whole of their life ahead of them. So those are some of the major concerns which are being raised, and rightly so. And these would have to be considered both by the government and the military chain of command.
Moving on now to the response that we've seen to the announcement. There have been violent demonstrations protesting the scheme in different parts of India. And a major reason cited by the protesters seems to be the lack of job security within the Agnipath scheme. And this really ties in back to the lack of permanent commissioning that you mentioned right at the start. In a country where unemployment is rampant and recruitment for the armed forces has not been carried out for the past 2 years due to the COVID-19 pandemic, the scheme has become all the more contentious. So, in terms of employability, what are the risks and challenges that you foresee?
Uh, so, after the railways, I think, or even before the railways and the military are two of the biggest employers, public sector employers in the Indian setup. The railway recruits a lot of manpower, the military recruits a lot of manpower. Uh, and for some regions, and I come from one of those regions where it is not only a question of honor to serve in the military, but it's also a question of livelihood. So in my village, every family has one or the other into the military, and that provides some kind of an anchor to for the whole family in a sense. So it's an economic anchor which is extremely important. Um, um, and and it's a profession which brings you some kind of economic stability, with, but also a lot of respect in the society. So for the youth, I think the military has always been quite enchanting, both because of economic aspects as well as the social aspects of it. Now, the question is that how would people who are looking at the military as a way of rising the social and the economic ladder react to a scheme where they are being deprived of something they have looked forward to for most of their life, in a sense, and see that as one of one of the best ways to stabilize their living conditions and their life, and that in some sense resulted into the protests and what followed after the reforms. Now it's difficult to predict how this reform will eventually pan out. One can say that it might pan out like the demonetization or the farm laws, but that's by taking those examples, it's an analysis in hindsight. There are a number of positives as well which can come out of this scheme. One is definitely the big elephant in the room is that there is only so much money. So you all governments and all countries have to decide to prioritize within that small pie of resources they have. Uh, so in some sense, if it can bring that respite to the Indian exchequer, it's a welcome move. Again, as I said, it would be only known in maybe in 10 years of time, because you need to have that much of time to see whether the pension part of the defense budgets are actually decreasing with this scheme. Uh, but it can also help a lot of India's youngsters to find better opportunities. At the end of the day, being trained by the Indian military provides a certain kind of discipline, provides a certain kind of ethos, provides a certain sense of motivation, to serve in the military, and that culture, that training, can help you, sustain yourself after you leave the military. And we have, the people who take even premature retirement from the military have succeeded in being great entrepreneurs, for that matter. Uh, but it also socializes you, in some sense, into thinking about problem solving. Uh, but one of the major aspects of it is that those 12 lakh rupees which you get in your hand provide you certain amount of capital to pursue specialized trainings, for that matter, education which you want, but you cannot, sponsor, or go for some kind of entrepreneurship. That's the idea behind the scheme, in a sense. And that 12 lakhs is a huge amount of money, in the hands of a 21, 22, 23 years of age, that young fellow. They can go into technical aspects of it if you are being technically trained, whether you are serving in the signals or the Air Force or the Navy. You can go into logistics, human resource management, entrepreneurship. So there is, in a sense, also depends upon the individual. But the Agnipath scheme aims to, and I'm saying aims to because we don't know the results as of now. That will only come, we can only analyze it after the first tour of duty of 4 years is finished. Can provide you those basic structures to be more successful in the society.
Finally, looking at potential implementation challenges, one striking difficulty that I observe has been with respect to getting all the stakeholders on board the scheme. We've already witnessed violent backlash, just like we discussed, and this is particularly important because a lack of consultation with relevant stakeholders is something that the Modi government has been accused of in the past as well. Could you throw some light on this, and are there any other challenges that you foresee?
Right. So one of the problems with the Modi government is its history of reforms. And not and how they have panned out. So there is one reference point of that, but I'm not so pessimistic. I think I accept that there are a number of challenges, but we will only come to know of the success or the failure of the scheme, as I said before, after the first tour of duty is over in next 4 years. The challenges which I think the government as well as the military has to confront are, first, that it does not disrupt the culture of India's armed forces. So that is the first one. That second, that the military efficiency should not be compromised. The third is that it is a very difficult period uh, for India's external security. The threat from Pakistan, and particularly the counterinsurgency in Kashmir, is still quite intensive. Uh, but the larger problem is China and the kind of forces China has put on India's borders, which are not only increasing in numbers but also technologically quite sophisticated. So the government as well as the military hierarchy has to see that the reforms which are being brought in does not lead to a situation where India might not be able to defend what it aims to defend, particularly both against Pakistan as well as China. So you need to have that surety that while continuing the reforms, you still have that buffer where you can, take on the challenges thrown by both China and Pakistan head on. The fourth challenge which the military and the government would have to, confront is that to to make the policy successful. Because if you are creating such a disruptive reform and not following it up with success, then the risks of investing in such a reform are huge. It would be very difficult for the military to go back to the old forms of its organizational structure. The government would be it would be also very difficult for the government to backpedal. So where if the scheme doesn't succeed, you Indian both the Indian military and the political decision makers would be in a very difficult situation. And the main thing they have to ensure is that the primary reason for it, which is basically saving enough money to put into capital investments into the military, particularly the technology, actually comes through. The government at some point in time should not backpedal on these savings and throw it somewhere else, which is very common in democracies, so to say, and do not provide the military the technology, the equipment it requires. And lastly, I think the question would be of rehabilitation. How do you rehabilitate these youngsters who are now trained in violence or perpetrating violence? And that's what a soldier's first job is, to rehabilitate them into the society where they actually, provide, in some sense, constructively engage with the society, with the economy, rather than facing a situation where it's difficult to manage youths who have been trained in perpetrating violence, and that, as some sociologists would say, might lead to extreme militarization of the Indian society. But I am not so pessimistic in a sense, because at the end of the day, there cannot be foolproof security or foolproof, insurance against some kind of militarization. But more or less, there is a feeling that such a tour of duty would result in, in creating a more disciplined society, a more entrepreneurial society, a society which is more constructively engaged, particularly the youth, then when they do not even have a prospect of getting employment at the first place, so to say. There is, in some sense, can be, and I'm just thinking about it, some kind of hidden agenda within the BJP as well. The militaries are sociologically quite conservative. So BJP might be looking at creating a new constituency, which in years to come would vote for a more conservative, government. And if you can actually look at the numbers, the military in disproportionate amounts, or military families in disproportionate amount, are highly nationalistic, and as well as conservative in their outlook. That's what militaries are. So there is an element of political socialization down the line. But that's just a surmise.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Yogesh. You were listening to South Asia Chat. To learn more about our work, visit us at isas.nus.edu.sg. You can also get updates on social media. We're on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram.